All right, we'll get started. Thanks, everyone, for responding to the threat of coercion. Thank you all for coming to this event as part of our Human Rights in Practice event series on human rights and biodiversity and conservation. I do have to note that our second speaker, Rochelle Diver, unfortunately had an emergency come up and isn't able to be with us today. But we're very, very excited to have Kristen Walker-Panamia with us from Conservation International, where she is the Senior Vice President and Managing Director of the Center for Communities and Conservation, and leads efforts to ensure that the organization and the broader conservation community implement a people-centered approach to conservation. Kristen provides institutional leadership and comprehensive technical assistance on a range of social and international policies related to Indigenous peoples and local communities, gender, human rights-based approaches, and social safeguards, as well as engagements with the peace and development community. Throughout her career, Kristen has led efforts on behalf of Conservation International and the conservation community to engage Indigenous peoples and local communities more effectively in conservation through a human rights-based approach. In 2003, Kristen created the Indigenous and Traditional Peoples Program to consolidate Conservation International's work with community partners, as well as to strengthen the collective capacity of Indigenous peoples and Conservation International to achieve mutual goals. In 2021, Kristen was elected to a second four-year term as chair of the Commission on Environment, Economic, and Social Policy of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And she has also led efforts on behalf of Conservation International to form the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, a consortium of international conservation NGOs that seek to integrate human rights in conservation policy and practice. So we'll do this as a sort of conversational style format. I have a set of questions that I will be asking Kristen. And for those who don't know me, I'm Monica Iyer. I'm a senior lecturing fellow with the International Human Rights Clinic here at Duke Law. So I'll ask Kristen a series of questions, and then we'll open it up to you all for your questions as well. And hopefully we'll be able to get to lots of those. So with all of that, Kristen, so I, a few years ago, started work in a position with the Climate Change and Environment mandate at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And one of the things that I was told would be a part of my role specifically was working on the office's efforts on biodiversity. And I kind of said, wait, what is that? Like, I understood the connection between climate change and human rights, but the biodiversity and conservation conversation was very new to me. So can you just start us off with an overview of the connection between biodiversity and conservation and human rights?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me and welcome. I'm glad we got people to move to the front, those of you who are physically with us and those who aren't. I'm glad you're there in our virtual world. It's a pleasure to be here, and I always get uncomfortable when people read my bios, but it is what it is, and we all have to get used to that uncomfortability. I think, when we talk about the connections between conservation and human rights, I think we need to understand the origins of conservation, right? Conservation began to protect the environment, our natural resources, but it also had a dual role. It also meant to keep people out in many ways, in many countries. And even the own protected areas system here in the United States was formed in a way that kept people out. There are other issues related to who protects biodiversity, who has access to biodiversity. We all depend on natural resources for our subsistence, our livelihoods, whether you live in an urban environment or whether you are an Indigenous community who lives in the Amazon. What the level of that access is very different, right? So in that sense, we are all connected to the issues around conservation, the issues around biodiversity, and the issue of whether you're looking at collective or individual rights. And I just want to be clear, I am not a lawyer, I'm not a human rights lawyer, but this is the area of work that I've sort of crossed over as well. So I will not use probably all the proper terminology here, but I think it's important. And it's been an important journey for the conservation community to understand a bit late. I think there have been issues that have arisen over the course of many years that has called out the conservation community in its efforts to protect the environment, but also in its efforts that it hasn't really been paying attention to issues of human rights or going beyond do no harm. And I think there are some of the issues we need to talk about. I think, we look at it from both an individual, here in the United States, we look at individual rights and our rights to things. You look at an indigenous community, it's their collective rights to either land or natural resources. And that plays a lot into the conservation context. Then you also look at the issues of nation states and how they interplay with rights and what their duties are to uphold human rights and their responsibilities. And then what the duties are of conservation organizations or other entities for business. So it has a large dynamic when we're talking about these issues, but it's only in the last 20, 25 years that organizations and folks have been specifically doubling it down and paying more attention to it. So maybe I'll stop there for.
Thanks. I think that was a really useful summary of the importance of rights in this space and recognizing that there are both individual and collective rights and also duties of duty holders, including individual and collective rights, like you said, to land, to property, to natural resources, to food, to water and sanitation that are all implicated by biodiversity and conservation efforts. And matters and lack thereof, right? So there's a big international conference coming up in December in Montreal that's expected to announce a new global agreement on addressing the biodiversity crisis. Can you tell us more about what's expected for that conference and in particular what we can hope for in terms of ensuring human rights are protected in new agreements?
So sure. Actually, I'll start first is that we have another big conference coming up, and it's the area that you worked on, climate change. We have the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. It's taking place in Egypt in just 2 weeks' time. And I think there was an important discussion that happened at that. It is really making the connection between climate and biodiversity and what impacts climate change has on biodiversity and biodiversity loss. So there's that connection right there between the two conventions. And then coming up, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity that will meet finally in Montreal after much delay with COVID. And I think really it has the premise that all nations should share resources, information to protect the planet. That's the premise of how it can move forward. And it really should look at fairness about how we do those things. And right now, it's really looking at how we can continue to bridge the issues of biodiversity loss and look at a pathway to broader restoration in 2030. That's the overall broad brush strokes. The negotiations of how we get there have been long and tedious, and I have to say we should have a lot more progress coming into this meeting in Montreal. That said, there's a large discussion about the need in this new framework that human rights and a rights-based approach needs to be incorporated across all of the framework, not just one element, but all of it, because it has to do with the policy, the governance, and the financing that is delivered under this new agreement, and how governments and how multiple actors will respond to these issues. There has been a little bit of progress. There was a meeting in June, and it looks like everyone's fairly in agreement on incorporating that language across the framework. That said, there's lots of other elements of the framework that are still in play, and it will become a game of brackets. Who gets what in the negotiation of brackets? But I think it's really important to determine really what that will mean, because that means it has to be an evolution of not just the language at the global policy level, but how that transformed change at the national, regional, but also at an institutional level, such as my own as an organization with Conservation International, or as the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, but also what that means for communities who are closest to nature. I'll pause there if you wanted to jump in.
No, actually, if you have more that you want to add on that, I have a couple of follow-up questions that stem from that, but some of them might be a little legal in terms of the brackets and where exactly acknowledgments of human rights might go. Maybe I'll ask that one very legal question, which is that in the Paris Agreement, we saw that there were debates around where human rights were going to go, and they ended up being included only in the preambular language of the agreement, which for people who are familiar or have a base, or since we have varying familiarity maybe with international law instruments, the preamble is considered to provide guidance to the interpretation, but not to be a binding portion of the instrument. So do you think that in the agreements that come out of the Convention for Biodiversity, COP, there will be a more, that the mainstream of human rights will be also in the binding sections?
I think that is the goal. Well, it's actually in goal. It's in the brackets in goal B. And that is the discussion that it should be represented across the framework, not just in the niceties at the top level. Still, that's still a push to get governments to agree to that as a collective. However, there was a larger consensus around those issues. But the results will happen when you see the negotiation, because there's always a curveball when it comes to those types of negotiations. But I also think it's gotten a larger weight now that we have the recognition of the rights to a healthy and clean environment, and that adds an additional weight. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment has been pushing that in his discussions at the Convention on Biological Diversity and at the broader UN. So that will carry ideally a larger weight that the UN in June had sort of, signed off on that. And that was a large push of those pieces as well.
Thank you for adding that. That's very helpful. So we can come back certainly to the conferences in the follow questions, but so one particular focus of your career has been Indigenous rights. Can you talk, and you've already alluded to this, but can you talk a little bit more specifically about the connections between Indigenous rights and conservation?
Sure, but I think at first it's probably important that I start a little bit with my own origin story. I began sort of my career as a Bright student on a Fulbright in southern Chile, and I worked with the Mapuche Indians on the border between Chile and Argentina, but at the same time I also met and married a Mapuche. So my in-laws live in their community. They have had to respond to land tenure issues in Chile, which isn't collective. They have had to respond to the issues of the forestry industry in Chile, which has had broad-scale Monterey and eucalyptus pine, which during the Pinochet regime often negotiated agreements or contracts on Mapuche lands, and now they're being returned over years, but they're highly degraded. So I've seen, and my in-laws continue to live in their community and confront climate change and the impacts of water and drought on their lands and territories. So that is the lens by which I have worked and tried to support Indigenous peoples in that context. As I've been in this area for a long time, I think conservation was always seen as a great ally of Indigenous peoples early on. And there's been certain blips on the screen where it hasn't been. And in 2003, there was a series of articles that were put out related to the relationships of conservation organizations and Indigenous peoples, that conservation really wasn't supporting Indigenous peoples in the way that it should be. I think it was an important area. Now, was everything right or not? I think there's probably different levels of that. But what I found working at my organization is that we really needed to take a step back and understand what we were doing and what we were not doing. And part of that process was, first and foremost, who were we working with, what are we doing, and how are we supporting communities? The other issue was, 20-some years ago, the conservation community may have been working on the ground here and having a larger voice in the international policy arena, but not connecting the dots. So what we say we're doing, we need to advocate for not only on the ground, but in this larger policy arena, and build that common agenda so that we're not just doing something in a certain area and not making sure that's reflected in these global agreements. So that is the premise and the importance of those things, that those discussions and agreements at the global level need to be reflective of the people closest to nature, whether they're Indigenous peoples or whether they're local communities. Because at the end of the day, they are the most impacted by those decisions, and they also need to respond to the context which they're in, which may include violation of rights, may include involuntary resettlement, may include impacts of what would happen and we'll talk a little bit about climate in terms of what mitigation happens and carbon offsets. So all of those pieces have been sort of the important set of issues. And if you look at the research today, Indigenous peoples, we cannot achieve our climate or biodiversity goals without working and supporting Indigenous peoples and local communities. Today, less than 1% of climate finance actually gets to Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's really a shocker. So if you look at what the research said, research that can be generated here at Duke and research at other places, there is a dichotomy about those pieces. And in between all of that is the threading of issues of rights, access, leadership, and so forth.
Thank you. That's, I think really helpful and useful to think about the fact that these are happening. The effort to protect nature, conserve biodiversity, and combat climate change are happening at all of these levels. And throughout all of these levels, we need to be aware of the rights of the people who are most affected, including often Indigenous communities. Following up on that a little bit and coming back to what you've, I think, already alluded to in a couple of your answers, there have at times been suggestions that environmental conservation and human rights may be in tension. And you mentioned that conservation was originally imagined as keeping people out primarily, and there's sometimes use of the term fortress conservation to refer to that model of conservation. And there have been allegations, certainly, of human rights abuses linked to that model. How you've talked about a little bit, I think, the efforts that have been made to try and move away from that model, avoid this kind of dichotomy, and employ a human rights-based approach. Going forward, how can you continue to build on efforts to move away from that? And to
So I think, the large conservation organizations, which are known as BINGOs, big international NGOs, came and, I'm the first one to talk about all of our laundry. But I think it's important to understand the large conservation NGOs came together to really talk about how to incorporate human rights more effectively into our conservation efforts, right? And that process began in 2009. And each institution has done it differently, has looked at the policies and practices. Some have been more out in international media due to issues of not understanding or keeping a track of what happens on the ground. Once you become these grants mechanisms and they go down, you lose track of who the end user is. And I think it's important, that we need to bridge what's going on at the global level. We need to bridge what's going on the ground. And then we need to look at what I call the plumbing of what happens in our own institutions. Is how do we, first and foremost, partner with our partners, be it Indigenous peoples and local communities. How do we make sure our policies and practices are being effectively implemented? How do we make sure that our staff actually understand what this means? We have, for many years, conservation organizations were full of biologists, great people, but they didn't necessarily have all the other skills to deal with everything else we have to deal with. So there has been a transformation of the conservation community over the last 25 years to be more interdisciplinary, to bring a lot of other issues to the table, to bring more voices of those we work with, more representative into those areas. And I think there are important issues, is that, first and foremost, an agreement of how we incorporate those issues. Many organizations have built up environmental and social safeguards, which are mitigation measures when we're dealing with projects, but it also helps us understand where we do and don't have capacities on dealing with those efforts. We also need to understand that countries and governments and peoples are not static. So while we may be doing something good over a 5-year period, something may change legally in a country, politically in a country, that has caused us to not be. But we also need to be able to speak at a much higher voice. We are often, as organizations, stuck between communities and the government, right? And we have duties on both, depending on the type of organization we are. We either are invited by that government to be there, or we may be an established NGO, and I'm speaking about the array of conservation organizations, and how we act, how we negotiate, and what our role really should be in making sure a government stands up to its duties on human rights, but that we as organizations do. And we are there for our partners. And that's always one of the biggest challenges. Like, often if an issue happens related to human rights, conservation organizations don't always stand up and respond as quickly as they should. And some of that's due, they're working behind the scenes, but others is trying to figure out how do you work on that interplay of these issues.
I think that's a really important thing for future lawyers to be considering, right? It's just in public interest, because you're often going to be in these roles where you're mediating between grassroots communities or communities that you're seeking to serve and sources of power, and figuring out ways to do that effectively, and ways to center the communities that you're partnering with, I think is often a huge challenge.
And it's even down to how do we do our contracts when we have financial resources and we're trying to get them to communities, making sure that we have the right language that reflects the protection of traditional knowledge. Where we talk a lot about intellectual property, we now have language in our own contracts that reflect the protection of traditional knowledge, to making sure that we have the right instruments in place, but to make sure that we're having a constant feedback loop with Indigenous peoples or local communities in those projects.
That's incredibly interesting. So I have many more questions, but want to give everyone else a chance to ask them too. But I do want to, before I turn it over to others, ask you to give us something sort of a little bit positive and hopeful. So I wanted to ask if there are key success stories that you can point to for how incorporating human rights-based approach to biodiversity and conservation issues have led to better outcomes.
I think overall, recently, within the work that I do with the IUCN Commission on Environment, Economics, and Social Policy, we've just done an analysis of efforts led and supported by Indigenous peoples, supporting their rights. And that shows, it's measured, it shows where we have better conservation outcomes. And that's a global study. I also want to show is that we are working on a number of projects right now. One is called the Dedicated Grant Mechanism for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And as financing was being talked for climate change, communities were not at the table, and they argued they should be at the table, they should receive the financing. So as a result, an $80 million funding mechanism was created. And I think what's important is this mechanism is in 13 countries. At each level, there's a governance by Indigenous peoples and local communities. There's a grievance mechanism so that as it rolls up, and if there's issues, that it can be addressed or be talked about amongst those. But the leadership of those projects and the decision-making is by those Indigenous peoples and local communities. So I think structuring the work that we're doing in conservation, where you're supporting that leadership of communities in these processes, where you're understanding the dynamics, is extremely important. We see other initiatives like the tenure facility that's really working to support communities in looking at their tenure rights, and that has been a huge success. And in this dedicated grant mechanism, we worked effectively through this money to support the increase in pace of tenure issues in Peru, for example. So when you're doing that and you're talking, you're listening, you understand those dynamics, and you're bringing in different partners to play different roles. Conservation organizations we're not going to become a whole bunch of human rights lawyers, but we should be bringing in human rights lawyers into our collaborations, into our staff periodically, but also having those partnerships so that we're doing better work and can understand that on both sides of the table.
Is it too early to tell us a little bit about some of the specific projects that are being implemented under the funding mechanism that you described?
So we have 13 across the globe that are ranging in looking at climate smart agriculture to better resource management, and they've all had a number of successes. I think we've gotten 250,000 hectares of land under new tenure. We have enabled the governance of the 13 projects. And we also have another project currently with the Global Environmental Facility. And this is the first large-scale grant that has been specifically for Indigenous and local community-led conservation. And again, it's another dynamic. The Indigenous organizations are actually fully executing anywhere between $500,000 to $2 million of funding as Indigenous organizations. And we're helping to support that capacity. But the irony of that type of money, it is public money. So when you have public money, you're required to respond to the environmental and social safeguards that have been negotiated. And many of that are the same ones that Indigenous peoples and local communities champion, but have also become barriers for them to get that. So again, we have to have another conversation and take those pieces apart. What does it mean to have what is required as an Indigenous peoples plan when it actually they are Indigenous peoples? So we've had to transform that to make sure that it's fully reflecting their processes, their customary ways, and recognizing that customary practice as part of that human rights pieces. So we have a number of those elements moving forward.
Thanks. And it's really, again, comes back to making sure that human rights is incorporated at all levels of this work. I will give other people a chance to ask their questions. Yes. And please feel free to introduce yourself as you're asking as well.
My name is Maggie, and I'm a Master of Public Policy student, actually. Thank you for coming and talking to us. It's been very interesting. One thing I'm interested in is kind of how diverse knowledge systems, values, worldviews are kind of included in conversations about natural resource management, protected area planning. So if you could speak to it, or how that is included in the conversations now, maybe in the projects you're starting.
Sure. So we have this, as I mentioned, this new inclusive conservation initiative that comes from the Global Environmental Facility. Given that this is Indigenous-led, we started off, how do we support this process? And we actually spent a virtual day, which is very challenging with communities, to actually have each of the communities talk about what their cosmovisions were, how you bring them together, and what their vision was for inclusive conservation under this initiative. And we're tying that through how we are working across this project. We're even tying that into the communications and branding, like making sure that that is reflected as part of who they are. I think you will find at different scales, you will see that incorporated more effectively. We worked in Guyana for a very long time with the YY people, and they were looking at protecting their lands. There was an entire process of what that was. There aren't words in their language looking at protected areas and management plans and this and that. So how do you come together and work with a very Western approach, but also make sure that that Western approach and those Indigenous values and practice and vision are incorporated? So we had 2 documents that incorporated language on both sides, having to come up with definitions or what that means from a perspective. So I think you're seeing that more and more. I think what we need to do is see the broader transformation of how protected areas are established in the future. There are really good case studies some places, and there are case studies where they're not so good, right? But I think the overall thread of bringing together nature and culture, if you look at a place like Papua New Guinea, the connection between biodiversity and language diversity is enormous. And it's a very small area, right? The amount of languages correlates almost directly to the biodiversity that's there. So that is an important thread. And if we lose one or the other, we'll cease to exist, right? So I think that's important. But we do that in our work at Conservation International. IUCN, through the work that we're doing, have a huge amount of work on nature and culture and how you thread those pieces together. And even at the World Heritage Convention, when they're looking at creating a new status, IUCN did stand up because rights were being violated. It was the first time, because IUCN always has to negotiate because it has so many members, but we put out a very clear statement about those violations. While I think the government still went forward on it, but it was really important that they stood out in that very public area and saying that this shouldn't move forward because of these issues. So it's all of those pieces that come together.
Others? I have several follow-up questions on that, but I'm going to.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm Michelle Nolan. I'm the co-director of the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. And I'm curious about, we think about human rights and rights of indigenous cultures, and that sounds great. And sometimes the reality is different. And so it's different when you're looking at an international timber company, for example, that is trying to, go in and harvest areas that have cultural and religious significance for an indigenous community. And that's one that seems easy from a human rights perspective. But then there are others where there are cultural practices that undermine the very concepts of biodiversity that we want to advance. Whether it's going in and harvesting mountain gorillas or lions or something as a rite of passage. And those types of indigenous practices can't be sustained in an era when we have all these other forces really constricting biodiversity. So how do you balance both of them legitimate in their own right, one with consequences that we really can't stomach right now?
So that is the 100 million, 500 million, $1 billion question. And I think that's the big challenge. And I think this is the critical point of the negotiations that are going to happen in Montreal, right? We're supposed to have this great global biodiversity framework. The issues of sustainable use or rights or passages of Indigenous people, the fact that there aren't enough species for them to do that is not necessarily their fault. Right. And it's to look at the historic and the legacy of accountability we have globally, which we have a hard time stomaching globally, right? So I don't have the exact answer for you there. It is a challenge because we want to support Indigenous peoples and local community in their rights, but they don't always make the decisions that we would like them to make, and that is something. But I also think about what is the impact of their decisions versus the larger context in the world and the decisions that have been made by governments and businesses and things of that nature. I think another thing, just building on that a little bit, one of the elements that we have been working with Indigenous peoples on is Indigenous negotiations. We have learned from a lot of the work that has been done in Australia and in Canada with First Nations, and then the negotiations they've had with extractive industries to be more fully reflective. And we've been working to bring that into the conservation because Indigenous people should be able to negotiate any type of agreement on their own terms, right? To reflect their strategies, their needs, but also make sure that they're not being violated, right? Because many times, and we've seen it time and time again in articles where companies or protected areas have come in, or we have new mechanisms, we have biodiversity offsets, we have carbon offsets, lots of transactions coming our way, but making sure that they have the information they need to understand what is going on, that they can come together, built on their practices, but also incorporating Western tactics, and be able to negotiate better terms for their lands and their communities. And I think that's becoming increasingly more important in the arena that we're working in.
Sort of as a follow-up to that, what happens when, say, extractive industries or other enterprises are using Indigenous groups with their rights to essentially circumvent, try and say, well, this is what they want, because they put them in a position that they can have profit and or schools or health or whatever it is. What is Conservation International doing?
I mean, I think so. I think the issue is the discussions around any community, whether it's Indigenous, it shouldn't all be focused on Indigenous communities, is how strong is the community and how strong is the community awareness around what the impacts may or may not be into the future and thinking towards that future. We're here in the U.S. and we see this all the time. We've seen it. I'm not going to start a lot of issues, but I think this is one of the issues. I mean, we can support Indigenous communities to the extent sometimes these negotiations around extractives are coming from other areas that we may or may not be fully engaged in. But I think it's also a response to how strong the community is in their conviction and their planning for their future and the future generations they have. So that's a challenge. I think what we're looking at as a conservation organization and to a large extent the community. And I think not just related to Indigenous peoples in the community, but what is the future? What is the future of conservation? We need new leaders. We need more dynamic leaders. We need to be interfacing more. We cannot ride in just one lane. And that goes across the board. So I think these are the harder transformative societal discussions we need to have that links not only Indigenous peoples, but all of these other pieces, because they all interplay. But I think first and foremost, whether we're in a certain country or not, there's oil and gas going on everywhere. Understanding who the players are, where we're at, getting the information we can, but also I think some of the challenges are when communities themselves are broken for one reason or another, whether it's due to Western society or government issues, and it allows communities to play off each other. But that's not only with Indigenous communities, it can happen in various types of communities to do so as well. So I didn't give you a really great answer, but it's complicated.
I want to, I think we've got enough time for me to also jump in a little bit because I wanted to ask something that was a little bit of a follow-up on your response to that. And again, this is, again, a quite legal question. Mm-hmm. So if it's too legal, then just tell me. But one thing that occurs to me in listening to your response and your emphasis on the need to consider Indigenous peoples, but also all other sort of local and affected communities is that we have this language in the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is Indigenous peoples and local communities grouped together, but often in the law, including in human rights law, but also in various domestic laws, there are specific protections for Indigenous peoples that don't exist for communities that don't have that designation. And maybe some of them should have that designation, are self-identified as Indigenous, but haven't been recognized as such in the law. But how does your support strategy change based on whether communities have that recognition?
I mean, I think we're obviously, who's Indigenous is self-defined, and we will work on that self-definition. We often, and actually our Indigenous, we have an Indigenous and Traditional Peoples program. It purposely has that soft language to be able to respond to some of that. I think, our work and commitments to the communities and the partnerships we have to bridge both Indigenous and human rights. And I think what we need to get better at as a larger conservation community and context is speaking up on those issues. And I think within the context of there is a discussion now within the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Climate Convention on the pairing of Indigenous peoples and local communities in that language and text because of those rights issues, right? And it's often, especially now in the climate negotiations, there's something called the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform. And the idea is to bring knowledge and practice to that high level. But right now it's very much dominated by Indigenous peoples because who is a local community? How do you define a local community? Where could be a local community here, or you could be a local community of rubber tappers in the Amazon. So how is that defined? So I think that also goes right back to your question. I would say in the Convention on Biological Diversity, there are local community groups who participate in a more holistic way. So you have communities from the Caribbean and others, but I think that's one of the challenges. Even though a community hasn't been recognized with those rights in a particular context or country, we would still work on issues of free, prior, and informed consent. We would still make sure that people have access to information. That is what we have committed to as an organization, and we would try to continue to support that and show by example in those countries.
Thank you for that. Others? Olivia.
Hi, my name is Olivia White. I'm with QL. And thank you again so much for coming to speak with us. I learned a lot so far. So today we spoke a lot about incorporating the human rights framework in conservation and biodiversity efforts. And so on the flip side, I was wondering, what do you think the human rights advocacy community can do better to incorporate conservation and biodiversity in their advocacy efforts? And then in addition to that, are there concerns with having the human rights community kind of co-opting the conservation and biodiversity efforts, I guess?
I actually think, I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's actually, we need to come together to have a stronger dialogue and discussion and share those skills. Because when we look at the issues, whether it's looking at resettlement, whether it's looking at environmental defenders, which is an issue we are grappling with on a daily basis, whether it's extractive, all of these issues interplay with the environment. So I think we all need to get better at speaking to each other and maybe not pointing the finger as much, but understanding where these things are coming from and where those challenges, and making sure that both sides have those skills. We had been working on the issues of environmental defenders, and we have sort of this Geneva roadmap. We were working with the High Commission on Human Rights, but we need to make sure that gets down to tactics in countries. Just as we have environmental defenders who are Indigenous people, but our own staff are also environmental defenders in different ways and have had those. So how do we make sure we're supporting our staff, our partners, et cetera, with the proper legal support that they need, that's not considered in the budget money that we get to do that. So how do we bring that much more broadly into those conversations? But I think it's bringing those communities together and really articulating those elements better at a higher level.
Do you think the recognition of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment? Forgot about whether safe was still in there or not for a second. Do you think that plays a role in bringing people together?
I think it can play a large role in doing that. And it was nice to see the large group of supporters behind moving that forward, both from the conservation and human rights community on those efforts. And then I think we also have the other discussion on the rights of nature, right? And that's the whole other dichotomy of that and what that fully means. So I think that does add a lot of more support. It opens those doors, but we need to be able to cross the aisle to be able to have those conversations.
Another question about the upcoming negotiation in Montreal. The U.S. is not a party to or a signatory of the Convention on Biodiversity. So will there be somebody from the U.S. in attendance, even though it's a COP meeting? And what role can the U.S. play when it's not a signatory in an important agreement like this?
Well, the U.S. hasn't been a signature for quite some time, for a long time, and there is always U.S. representation into that discussion. I think they often play a lot of behind-the-scenes roles. They are looking at, and they finance a lot of work related to conservation, increasingly more around, they've made now major commitments as part of this $1.7 billion pledge of direct access for Indigenous peoples and local communities for financing under climate, but crosses over biodiversity. So while they're not a signatory, which, that's a whole other conversation, they are there and they are present in terms of its technical function and role. And they do invest a lot through its overseas development aid in conservation efforts.
We've got a little bit of time for that conversation if you want to elaborate specifically on sort of if there are movements to encourage the U.S. to join, and if so, or if not, what's the strategical reasoning behind?
I won't elaborate fully, but I mean, there's always, and I'm not our lead policy person at CI, there's always encouragement to have the U.S. join, right? We saw what happened with the Paris Agreement and the in and out. Globally, that doesn't look good. And globally, the U.S. is doing a lot, and they should really show better example by engaging in that. But I think I'll leave it there because, again, it's a much larger discussion. They haven't signed on to it. They haven't never signed on to it. So that's been an ongoing element, and I think still it ties with our internal conversations here between climate and conservation itself, right? And the transformation we are having in certain areas of the United States and not in others.
Others? We've got
There was
time.
a reaction up here, yes or no?
I was just thinking, like, when we were speaking earlier about how you balance, not necessarily extractive, but not good for biodiversity practices with Indigenous rights, how do you balance, like, women's rights abuses by Indigenous communities?
So there's a whole body of work that we are doing around gender and gender-based violence and what the origins of that are. How do we need to engage? And I think, within the context of IUCN, actually they're being funded highly by USAID on a project called Agent, looking at gender-based violence in the context of conservation. I think in the experience that Conservation International has had, and specifically one in the Galapagos, is that we had a work with fishing communities on an incentive program, and did a consultation, et cetera, and began to do work. And several communities didn't engage. They didn't do X, Y, and Z. And what happened was they saw what was happening with the communities who engaged in the project and the incentives that were happening. And what we could see on the other side, it began to emerge, is that there was frustration on those communities. There was lack of engagement in fishing. Some people were out of jobs, and what happened was, as you saw, increased violence in families, which was something that our staff, hadn't. It's one of those areas that, again, as an organization, our scope of work continues to expand. And how do we make sure that we have the tools as an institution to look at the issues or the impacts and make sure that we're clearly understanding the dynamics of the communities we're working in, and what could happen positively, negatively related to any program we put forward, whether it's incentive-based or whether it's that, and understanding the underlying issues that are in those communities. So we're not always going to know, even no matter how much consultation, et cetera, because there's certain, and how do we work to transform those issues? So there is a lot of work, and there's a large body of work around issues of gender-based violence and rights, but also work that we're looking at in the connection of reproductive rights and family planning in the context of conservation as well. So again, it's dovetailing amongst all of these issues.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, and maybe want to end by giving you a chance to maybe speak a little bit more broadly to gender and conservation issues, and just to note that along with empirical research that shows that when Indigenous peoples have better control over conservation efforts, there's better conservation outcomes. Similarly, when women are given more control over land use and natural resources use, there's also empirical research that shows that leads to better conservation practices. But I don't know if you want to elaborate more on.
I mean, I think you've hit that nail on the head, right? I mean, I could tell you, even in my own personal experience, when I go to the community and I see my mother-in-law, I know who's behind the scenes and looking at those pieces. But I think, that has been an evolving body of work in the last 10 to 15 years in the broader conservation community, trying to build on that data that's out there, but also making sure that culturally, when we go into a community, we can't just go in with a banner raised that we're going to transform everything from a Western perspective. I think we need to understand, and we need to engage not only women, but across the gender spectrum, youth and elders in this process. And making sure that we're not just targeting certain elements. So that comes with a set of skills and issues that we need to look at. We need to look at how that engagement is, understand what communities are doing and what the different actors are, and how do you continue to bridge and build that support on these issues. We, as Conservation International, we've had a long-term Indigenous Fellows program, for example, that has had it globally. We have now an investment in the Amazon through the government of France, and we really actually focus this fellowship on Indigenous women. And it's been amazing to see, to support them, and many of the Indigenous organizations have overall supported them, but what happens when you bring Indigenous women together from the Amazon who are all trying to do things in their communities, and you bring them together as a collective? It's extremely powerful. And then they feel like they're energized, and they can go back and look at those interventions. And I think you're also seeing the transformation, and I'll say in many of the organizations, but even in the Indigenous organizations, particularly in places like the Amazon or Africa, which was principally male-led or male-dominated. I can tell you, I was in 2003 when all the leaders of the conservation NGOs sort of ran back when we were getting criticized. It was several white women who were talking to Indigenous men from all over the world. It was very interesting, the dynamic, what had happened then when you're trying to understand what's going on. And now you're seeing a transformation at multiple scales, not only with Indigenous organizations, but across our own organizations, and making sure that we're really making that relevant as part of that work. And many of these major funders are understanding what does gender mainstreaming mean. That also comes with a lot of requirements. that also may or may not be positive or negative, and only time will tell, right? I think one of the things we need to be careful of as we continue to expand this work, which is all really important, that we don't get bogged down in all the bureaucracy to achieve it. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that as a collective we have, and how to facilitate that work more effectively.
Anyone else have a... So I'll just ask one final follow-up before we close to just get to that exact point. In the climate space and talking about both of these big upcoming negotiations, there's been a lot of conversations about who gets a seat at the table, both in terms of who's allowed to enter these spaces, but then also in terms of the governments, who governments send as their representatives in the biodiversity space as well as in the climate space. What do you see in terms of diversity, both of groups that are admitted, but also in terms of who governments allow to?
I think the first answer is we should all have a seat at the table. So I think that's first and foremost. I think, early on, the Convention on Biological Diversity was much more welcoming and opening to Indigenous peoples, local communities, women's groups, et cetera. It has taken the climate convention a lot longer to do that. I represent an NGO. I don't sit on a delegation, but what we have seen, and we worked with, not only with our institution is providing our technical expertise to delegations, but we've also worked to negotiate Indigenous peoples as part of delegations. And you're seeing that more and more on national level delegation. That doesn't mean they have the voice for the government fully, but you are seeing that engagement and more holistic approach and bringing together various actors to support a country's position, which is how it should be, because it should be more representative of those issues. That's still a challenge, and I think while the negotiations at a global scale are important, these conversations at a local level, subnational level, a national level are most important, because that's where the rubber hits the road. The big question on all of these agreements is the implementation, and that takes time. It takes time, it takes work. It takes understanding all of the legal frameworks to make those things happen, but it also, the impacts are seen closest to the ground. So while we spend, and I will spend the next 2 months in these negotiations at various levels, the end of the day, it gets back to what is the impact on the ground? How are people responding? What's happening to them?
All right. Thank you so much. If everyone join me in thanking Kristen.